Hi, Professor Ellie Anderson here, and today I'm going to be sharing with you a presentation that I gave at the University of Memphis in 2017 as part of the annual SPEP conference. For those who may not know, SPEP, or the Society for Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy, is the second biggest annual philosophy conference in the United States, and it is the biggest one for those of us who work in continental European philosophy. So if any of my friends from SPEP are watching this, hello. Hello to the wonderful niche of, or the members of the niche of continental philosophy. And this paper is about Derrida and Husserl. It is obviously an academic paper, so it's pitched higher than some of my other YouTube videos. So if you are more interested in just kind of a general overview of some of these thinkers, check out my Continental Thought Lectures playlist. But this is a paper that's delivered and meant for other people working in this field of philosophy. Okay, so the title is A Strict Phenomenologist, which is a quote from Derrida. Derrida's Affirmation of Husserlian Intersubjectivity. As is well known, Derrida occupies an intentionally marginal place in phenomenology. Having begun his career as a promising scholar of Husserl, Derrida went on to deconstruct fundamental aspects of the phenomenological project throughout his career, beginning with his 1953 to 54 memoir, The Problem of Genesis in Husserl's Philosophy. While many scholars have written about Derrida's relation to Husserl and to phenomenology more generally, a crucial aspect of this area has remained unexplored in my view. That is, Derrida's unequivocal affirmation of Husserl's theory of intersubjectivity. In both his published and unpublished work over the span of his career, Derrida argues that Husserl's notion of analogical appresentation is unparalleled in its respect for the otherness of other beings. In fact, Derrida takes analogical appresentation to offer a more persuasive account of alterity than one that might appear closer to Derrida's concerns, that of Levinas. In this presentation, I will analyze a number of places where Derrida defends the Husserlian theory of analogical appresentation with two aims in mind. I hope first to encourage philosophers with a commitment to an ethical respect for otherness to revisit Husserl's phenomenology as a more coherent account of alterity than the currently dominant Levinasian model. And second, to show that Derrida retains a phenomenological notion of the first-person perspective, even as he deconstructs its pretensions to transparency and mastery. Derrida shows that it's only when one maintains a notion of subjectivity, albeit one that is haunted or contaminated by otherness, that an ethically inflected account of intersubjectivity is coherent. The notion of intersubjectivity that interests Derrida is the one that Husserl famously develops in the fifth of his Cartesian meditations. Here, Husserl analyzes the way that other human beings appear to consciousness and terms this mode of appearance analogical appresentation. Appresentation, or I'm trying to say it in French, guys. It's a German word. Forgive my German accent. Appresentation, a term Husserl introduces in the 1920s but never rigorously defines, suggests a kind of object presentation that implies that what one sees is only one side of an object that has other aspects to it. Husserl identifies two forms of appresentation. First, that which pertains to objects in the world, and second, that which pertains to what he calls psychophysical objects, by which Husserl means other beings. In perceiving an entity of either of these categories, I can never perceive all its sides at once. When I look at a building, I perceive only its front side. So too when I perceive another person. However, I can go around to the other side of the building and go inside of it. Even though it will never be the case that all sides will be present to me at once, all sides of the building are in principle accessible. This is not the case with other beings. Even though others are embodied and therefore do present different sides in a spatial sphere that is open to my perception, their bodily multidimensionality does not exhaust their identity. A psychophysical object is an alter ego, that is, another person who lives from his or her own conscious first-person sphere. This suggests that appresentation in the case of other people is not only incomplete in fact, as it was with the building, but also incomplete in principle. I cannot go around to the other side of the person because the other side of the person is not her body, but rather her perspective on the world, including her subjective processes and appearances. Husserl states that the appresentation of objects, quote, involves the possibility of verification by a corresponding fulfilling presentation. The back becomes the front. Whereas in the case of that appresentation, which would lead over into the other original sphere, such verification must be excluded a priori, end quote. The first-person perspective of the other, which Husserl calls the original sphere of the ego, is inaccessible to me because it is precisely the nature of the ego to embody an irreplaceable perspective. In what sense, then, is this appresentation by which we encounter the other being analogical? We must here resist the risk of reinscribing Cartesian dualism by presuming that analogy indicates something like the following. Because I am a psychophysical object in the world, I have a body and also consciousness. I perceive another psychophysical object over there, so it too must have consciousness. So that approach is wholly misguided because it amounts to a version of dualism that posits consciousness over and above the body. Yet Husserl's notion of a psychophysical object is precisely meant to guard against this. And I'm using psychophysical object here. There's a more complicated story to tell there. I recommend the work of Sarah Heinema if you want to learn more about that. But just to kind of note, this is like part of the story, but it's a bit more complicated when we're thinking about the body consciousness. I was going to say relation, but it's kind of wrong. The nature of body consciousness in Husserl. This approach is wholly misguided because it amounts to a version of dualism. Oh, I already read that sentence. Okay, starting from the next one. It's not that I cannot access the alter ego because she has an extra non-physical part of herself, that is the consciousness, that is inaccessible to my perception in the physical world. Rather, the alter ego is analogous to the ego in as much as each of us has an irreplaceable perspective, or in as much as our presence to each other indicates an insurmountable absence to each other. In a move likely to surprise those familiar with Derrida's deconstruction of Husserl's transcendental ego, Derrida repeatedly defends the Husserlian theory of the alter ego and claims that it exhibits a remarkable regard for otherness. So just a quick sidebar here. Some of this is coming out of my dissertation research. My dissertation was on self-other relation in Derrida and the nature of subjectivity. In fact, Derrida brings it up in a positive light, that is Husserl's theory of the alter ego, in a surprising number of places throughout his writings, including in his formulation of the famous phrase, tout autre et tout autre, from the gift of death. Because the notion of analogical appresentation developed in Husserl's fifth Cartesian meditation foregrounds the irreducible lack of direct access one has to the experience of the other, Derrida takes it to be a genuine thinking of otherness. And he goes so far as to say in an interview from the 1990s that, quote, from the point of view of Husserl's fifth Cartesian meditation, I remain a strict phenomenologist, end quote. I find this fascinating. That's why I titled the paper, A Strict Phenomenologist. And he writes, quote, in the fifth Cartesian meditation, Husserl insists that there is no pure intuition of the other as such, that I have no originary access to the alter ego as such. I should go, as you know, through analogy or appresentation. Derrida states that he finds this argument irrefutable. So Derrida remains a strict phenomenologist insofar as he recognizes that the condition for the possibility of the appearance of an other is that one have a fundamental lack of access to the position of that other. The theory of the alter ego in Husserl is one by which Derrida stands because it thematizes the confrontation with other beings precisely as gesturing toward the alterity of those other beings as that which cannot be confronted. When there is a risk of presuming, quote, an immediate access to the other, end quote, for instance, which is the gesture of violence that would bring the other into oneself and do away with the distance between the two, Derrida states that, quote, Husserl's cautious approach will always remain before us as a model of vigilance. It is necessary to watch over the other's alterity. It will always remain inaccessible to an originally presentive intuition, an immediate and direct presentation of the here. The other presents himself to me as another here, and this can never be overtaken by myself. Even if I switch positions with the other, I can never be in their position, properly speaking. The here of the other is always necessarily a there to me, and vice versa. The singularity of the other is what renders the other inaccessible and non-present to oneself. The fact that the non-presence of the other is present to oneself, the other is a phenomenon, but a phenomenon that attests to an excess of phenomenality, indicates that the other will never be presented originarily. And this lack of originary access to the other is expressive of otherness as such. Thus, Derrida invokes Husserl as a thinker of the tout autre et tout autre, insofar as the alter ego, encountered in analogical appresentation, is infinitely other, and its irreducible singularity, beyond presence and grasp of the same. The infinite other is made possible by appresentation, or representation within the calculative economy of the same. This defense of Husserl is in contrast with Levinas, who writes off Husserl's theory because he takes the notion of alter ego to model the other on the self. Yet Derrida asserts that it is only by, quote, misconstruing his most permanent and openly stated intentions, end quote, that one can claim that Husserl's theory of the alter ego implies an other who is like myself. Derrida states that, quote, Levinas and Husserl are quite close on this point, end quote, or quite close as the end of quote on this point, suggesting a surprising kinship between Derrida and the ethical view of alterity for which Levinas is so well known. There is, however, a crucial difference between Husserl and Levinas, with Derrida clearly taking Husserl's side. Husserl includes the analogical notion that one relates to other beings as alter egos, whereas Levinas maintains only the insight into the constitutive alterity of the other. This leads Derrida to prefer analogical appresentation to Levinas's seemingly more radical account of the encounter with alterity, for reasons we will now explore. Derrida's defense of Husserlian analogical appresentation over and against Levinas goes back to his essay, Violence and Metaphysics, this famously important but also very difficult essay. And in this essay, Derrida takes issue with the Levinasian rejection of the Husserlian notion that the other is an alter ego. Derrida claims that the absence of an alter ego undermines the Levinasian project, and that it is the very claim that the other is infinitely beyond all figuration as an alter ego that proves untenable for Levinas's own conception of alterity. Without a Husserlian idea of the alter ego, Levinas is left paralyzed with regard to explaining how one could encounter the other as other. For Husserl, the appearance of the other is a, quote, intentional modification of the ego, end quote, even as this modification precisely discloses that the other is infinitely other. According to Derrida, taking the encounter with the other to be a modification of one's own ego gives Husserl the right to speak about the encounter with the other. Because Levinas's discourse, on the other hand, uses the language of the same to describe the other, even as he rejects the schema. Levinas, quote, deprives himself of the very foundation and possibility of his own language, end quote. And because of this failure, Levinas is less able to take into account the otherness of the other than Husserl. Husserl's approach to alterity is thus more coherent than that of Levinas because it acknowledges the irreducible role of the ego, or the first-person sphere of sameness. Derrida writes, quote, if the other were not recognized as a transcendental alter ego, it would be entirely in the world and not as ego, the origin of the world. To refuse to see in it an ego in this sense is, within the ethical order, the very gesture of all violence. If the other was not recognized as ego, its entire alterity would collapse, end quote. So yeah, this is still from, that quote was just from Violence and Metaphysics, which is the essay of Derrida's that I've been talking about for a bit now. And I'll put the references from this presentation in the caption of the video. It is precisely because the other is an ego that I'm able to treat her as other. To fail to recognize the other as an alter ego would be to overlook her first-person perspective. That is, it would be to fail to see that there is more to the other than I myself can ever access through the structured analogical appresentation that organizes my relation to the other. Far from reducing the other to oneself, which Levinas accuses Husserl of doing, Husserlian phenomenology on Derrida's view precisely singles the impossibility of reducing the other to the same, even as it claims that the other appears as other within the domain of the same. It may be surprising to find Derrida defending a version of what I have been calling the first-person perspective. After all, he consistently deconstructs traditional models of subjectivity and the phenomenological ego throughout his career. At this point, I would like to suggest that another overlooked dimension of Derrida's work is his preservation of a first-person perspective, albeit one that is subject to deconstruction. This was literally the topic of my dissertation. My publications have moved away from it in recent years, but we'll see. Maybe I'll come back to it. Deconstruction does not eliminate first-person perspective, sameness, or selfhood, but rather encourages us to think it differently. The first-person perspective is split in its origin or haunted by second and third-person perspectives, but it is nonetheless necessary for any experience, including the confrontation with the other. In the unpublished 1992 to 1993 seminar, Répondre du secret, témoigner, this is something that I studied in the Derrida archives, gorgeous archives in Normandy. Oh my God, absolutely amazing. So in this unpublished seminar, Derrida remains insistent that the structure of analogical appresentation is a condition for the possibility of the experience of the other as other. This emerges particularly in the idea that we must believe others when they bear witness, témoigner, having faith in what they say because we cannot submit their beliefs to proof. We can never know if another is speaking ingenuously or disingenuously because we can never have access to the other from within. There's also a cool book on this called Derrida's Secret by Charles Barbour that I reviewed for some publication, I forgot, but he has more on this too. That's quite interesting. For Derrida, any witnessing requires a singular existence and a level of interiority or of, quote, what happens or is experienced within someone, within some singular existence, ego or Dasein, there where the other can in no way have a direct, intuitive, and originary access. Derrida states that lack of this access on the part of the other is particularly illustrated by Husserl's fifth Cartesian meditation, which is, quote, one of the best paths to follow in order to describe, quote, this zone that remains at bottom, that of the secret and of absolute singularity, of that which is absolutely my own and of which I cannot even expropriate myself. And shortly afterward in the same session, Derrida insists that the singularity of one's own consciousness is the condition for the possibility of bearing witness or of communicating with others in general. He writes, and I know there's a lot of quotes in this part of the presentation, but that's because this is coming from archival research and these are not published. So it's important for me to give folks the information, right? And to offer the full quotes here. Okay, and these are my translations too. So he writes, quote, no one can enter into the consciousness of the other. I am alone with myself at a given moment, and the condition of bearing witness is that someone who is alone with him or herself, this is seul avec soi in French, can say to someone else, this is what I feel, this is what I live, this is what I understand. It is impossible to break into the cogito of others. Husserl has rigorously described the impossibility of an originary intuition of the consciousness or ego of others. I can only access the ego of others indirectly by analogy or appresentation, end quote. So here we see that for Derrida, there is a domain of secrecy within the self that gives one privileged access to one's own feelings and thoughts. No one can break in to that domain within another person. Without the secrecy within oneself, there would be no need for communicating or bridging the gap with others. Analogical appresentation at once bridges the gap and shows that it is impossible to do so completely. So of course, it would be wildly undeconstructive merely to posit the irreducibility of the first person perspective and leave it at that. What would become of the internal difference that deconstruction so constantly reveals in what purports to be self-same? After all, even as Derrida subscribes to the phenomenological account of intersubjectivity, he is not a thoroughgoing Husserlian. It's worth recalling that Voice and Phenomenon, an early book of his, precisely constitutes a troubling of the unmediated self-relation that Husserl posits through his distinction between expression and indication and the analysis of internal time consciousness. Here, I would like to draw attention to such a moment within the same unpublished seminar, where Derrida speaks of a duality already within the first-person perspective, in light of the experience of bearing witness. In order for it to be possible to bear witness, quote, it is necessary that one be two, end quote. Or in French, it's il faut qu'on soit deux. And Derrida writes, quote, when I say I cannot believe otherwise, that this happens uniquely in me, it means that in one there are two, end quote. That is, bearing witness to one's belief reveals that what appeared to be one is in fact more than one. There's difference or duality already within interiority. This is not at the expense of the acknowledgement of first-person perspective, although it does demonstrate that this experience is internally riven. Yet it is only when we take the first-person perspective to be an irreducible feature of belief relations with others that otherness even makes sense, whether within or outside the self. And within and outside are very much in scare quotes there. While Derrida follows Husserl quite far when it comes to analogical appresentation, then, he does not subscribe, Derrida that is, does not subscribe to a phenomenological conception of the ego. For him, the non-presence of the other is a rupture within phenomenology. In addition to this, but also related to it, Derrida interrupts the presence to self that phenomenology foregrounds. Corresponding to the basic gesture of deconstruction, Derrida suggests a radicalization of the self-other relation that unsettles a traditional binary and affirms a different way of thinking about its terms as mutually contaminating. That is to say, Derrida deconstructs the first-person perspective of phenomenology in order to reveal that it is internally contaminated by otherness and split at its origin. As Derrida puts it in the untranslated interview, Fidelity to More Than One, did I translate this? Did somebody translate this? I worked on the translation of this. Fidélité à plus d'un. I think I was, as a grad student, working on this. Yes, I did not translate. I think David Wills translated it. You might have it available now because this presentation is from 2017. Anyway, so in this interview, Fidelity to More Than One, the relation to alterity in general, quote, this is a quote, the relation to alterity in general, this experience of an invisibility in the visible where non-phenomenality is necessary, is something like a self-interruption by the phenomenology of Husserl in his Cartesian Meditations or by that of Levinas throughout his entire work, end quote. Despite the fact that Derrida sees in Husserl many of the quintessential gestures of metaphysics, he also views in Husserl's theory of intersubjectivity something that escapes metaphysical overdetermination and compromises the theory of transcendental subjectivity. Husserl's account of the alter ego interrupts the saturated sphere of phenomenology and opens it to an alterity beyond it. Thus, Derrida at once remains a strict phenomenologist in his account of intersubjectivity, and argues that Husserl's very account of analogical appresentation suggests a constitutive absence within phenomenology. Cool. That's the end of the presentation. It's been fun to revisit this by reading it for you all. Decided to do this because the original presentation was not filmed. And so why not put this out there, especially because I have not published this in an article, at least as of now. We'll see if I do, like I said, or if I end up developing it into a longer project. And I will say, I just confirmed too that Fidélité à plus d'un, which is the Fidelity to More Than One interview that I quoted towards the end, is indeed translated by David Wills. And yes, I did help with that at the Derrida Seminars Translation Project, and I think like 2015 or 2016. And I have it as forthcoming here. So check it out. It might be out now, although there has been some slowness of in publishing some of the Derrida interviews that a number of us have translated because of COVID and all this stuff. Okay, cool. Check out my podcast Overthink, other videos if you're interested.